The morning sun peeked through the curtains as Dorothy Williams got ready for her Tuesday shopping trip. At 78 years old, she moved a bit slower these days, but she still took pride in her independence. She carefully pinned her silver hair back and chose her favorite blue dress with tiny white flowers, the one her late husband James always said brought out the warmth in her eyes. Dorothy had lived in the same neighborhood for over 50 years. She'd raised her children here, taught at the local elementary school for nearly 4 decades, and knew just about everyone. Most folks around town still called her Mrs. Williams out of respect, even parents of students she'd taught long ago. Keys, purse, shopping list, she mumbled to herself, going through her mental checklist. Dorothy was organized, always had been. Her students used to joke that she could find a paper from 3 years ago in under a minute. She smiled at the memory as she locked her front door. The walk to Green's grocery wasn't long, just 3 blocks down Maple Street. Dorothy enjoyed the exercise and the chance to wave at neighbors tending their gardens or heading off to work. Mrs. Chen from the corner house called out a greeting, and the Johnson kids riding bikes to school stopped to help her cross at the busy intersection. "How's your grandson doing in college, Mrs. Williams?" asked the mail carrier Tom, who was sorting letters at the community mailboxes. "Oh, he's doing just fine. Made the dean's list last semester," Dorothy replied, her voice filled with pride. "Studying engineering, just like his grandpa wanted." By the time Dorothy reached Green's grocery, her cloth shopping bags tucked under her arm, the morning rush had settled. The automatic doors whooshed open, greeting her with cool air and the familiar smell of fresh bread from the bakery section. "Morning, Mrs. Williams. The peaches came in fresh today," called out Ronnie, the produce manager who'd been working at Green's since he was a teenager bagging groceries after school. "Thank you, dear. You know, I can't resist a good peach cobbler recipe," Dorothy smiled, pulling out her reading glasses to check her neatly written list. Dorothy had her routine down to a science: produce first, then dairy, canned goods, and finally the bread that she liked to pick up last so it wouldn't get squished. She carefully selected 6 peaches, testing each one for ripeness the way her mother had taught her decades ago. Then she moved on to pick up some green beans, carrots, and a head of lettuce. The store wasn't crowded, but there were enough people around that Dorothy noticed when things got unusually quiet in her aisle. She looked up from examining a tomato to see 2 police officers walking through the produce section, their eyes scanning the shoppers. Dorothy didn't think much of it. Officers often stopped in for coffee or lunch from the deli counter. She continued shopping, placing her items carefully in the cart. Her Social Security check had come in yesterday, which meant she could splurge a little on some fresh fish for dinner. As she wheeled her cart toward the seafood counter, she noticed the officers again, this time watching her more directly. Dorothy had lived through enough history to recognize when something didn't feel right. The civil rights movement, segregation, the slow march of progress. She'd seen it all. That familiar tension crept into her shoulders, the one she hadn't felt in years, but never quite forgot. "Excuse me," she said to the young man behind the seafood counter. "Do you have any of that tilapia on sale today? The one advertised in the flyer?" The young man started to answer, but his eyes darted nervously past Dorothy. She turned to find the 2 officers standing directly behind her, uncomfortably close. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," said the taller officer, his hand resting near his belt. "I'm sorry." Dorothy adjusted her glasses, certain she must have misheard. "We've received reports of shoplifting in this area," said the second officer, younger with a clean-shaven face that reminded Dorothy of her youngest grandson. "We need to check your bags." Dorothy felt her heart quicken, but years of handling classroom disruptions had taught her to stay calm in tense situations. "Officers, there must be some mistake. I haven't even finished my shopping yet," she said, gesturing to her half-filled cart and the list still in her hand. "I've been coming to this store for over 30 years. The taller officer stepped closer. "Ma'am, empty your purse, please." Dorothy noticed people starting to stare. Mrs. Rodriguez from her church book club was watching from near the bakery. A young mother pulled her curious child closer. The seafood counter boy stood frozen, a piece of fish in his hand. Dorothy Williams had never stolen anything in her life, not once. And now, in the middle of Green's grocery where everyone knew her, where she taught half the town's children to read, she was being treated like a criminal. What no one knew yet was that this moment would change everything, not just for Dorothy, but for the entire community. Dorothy's fingers trembled slightly as she clutched her purse closer to her chest. The taller officer, his nameplate read Officer Wilson, stood with his arms crossed, looking down at her with cold eyes. "Ma'am, I won't ask again. Empty your purse on the counter now." His voice carried through the quiet store, making several shoppers stop and stare. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Dorothy said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I haven't even been to the checkout yet. I'm still shopping." She gestured to her half-filled cart with the shopping list still visible on top of her produce. The younger officer, who couldn't have been more than 25, shifted uncomfortably. "We received a call about someone matching your description," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Dorothy felt a chill. Someone matching her description. An elderly black woman with silver hair and a blue dress? How many of those could possibly be in the store right now? "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," Dorothy said, drawing herself up to her full 5 feet, 3 inches. She had dealt with bullies before, both in the classroom and during the harder days of her youth. "Or the store manager. Ronnie knows me. I've shopped here for decades." "Look, lady," Officer Wilson cut in, his voice hardening. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do this downtown. Your choice." A small crowd had gathered now. Dorothy could see Mrs. Rodriguez whispering to another shopper. The seafood counter boy had disappeared, hopefully to find the manager. "I have nothing to hide, officer," Dorothy said, opening her purse slowly. "But I want everyone here to know that I've never stolen anything in my life." Her hands shook as she began removing items, her wallet, a small calendar book, reading glasses case, a pack of tissues, and a roll of mints. "Turn the wallet over and open all the compartments," instructed Wilson, watching each movement like a hawk. The second officer at least had the decency to look embarrassed. "Maybe we could move this to the manager's office?" he suggested quietly. "No," Wilson replied sharply. "Right here is fine." Dorothy felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as she emptied her wallet, her ID, a few credit cards, a photo of her grandchildren, and $43 in cash. The money she'd specifically withdrawn to pay for today's groceries. "And what about your pockets?" Wilson demanded, pointing to her dress. "This dress doesn't have pockets, officer," Dorothy replied, fighting to keep her voice from breaking. By now, the crowd had grown larger. Dorothy recognized several faces, parents of former students, neighbors, and regular shoppers she'd exchanged pleasantries with over the years. An older white man in a plaid shirt stepped forward. "Hey now, what's going on here?" "That's Mrs. Williams you're hassling. She taught half the town to read, including my 2 boys. Sir, please step back." "This is police business," Wilson said without taking his eyes off Dorothy. "What exactly is she supposed to have stolen?" asked a middle-aged woman holding a basket of groceries. "She hasn't even checked out yet." Dorothy felt a mix of embarrassment and gratitude as more people began to murmur and question the officers. Wilson's radio crackled, and he stepped back slightly to respond. Dorothy took the moment to carefully return her belongings to her purse, her hands still trembling but her spine straight. She may be humiliated, but she would not be broken. "I've worked in this town for 40 years as a teacher," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've never had so much as a parking ticket. I don't appreciate being treated this way in my own community." The younger officer looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we're just following up on a call." "A call about what, exactly?" A new voice cut through the tension. Dorothy turned to see Ronnie, the produce manager, standing with Mr. Green himself, the owner of the grocery store. Mr. Green was in his 60s, with salt and pepper hair and the stern expression of someone who didn't appreciate drama in his establishment. "Mrs. Williams is one of our most valued customers," Mr. Green said, stepping between Dorothy and the officers. "What exactly is happening here?" Officer Wilson straightened his back. "We received an anonymous call about shoplifting, just doing our job." "By harassing an elderly woman who hasn't even finished shopping," Mr. Green asked. "Do you have any actual evidence, or is this just—" He stopped himself, but everyone knew what he was thinking. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dorothy stood tall despite her racing heart, looking Officer Wilson directly in the eyes. She'd lived through too much in her 78 years to be broken by this man. What happened next would change everything, not just for Dorothy, but for everyone watching. The quiet grocery store on an ordinary Tuesday was about to become the stage for something extraordinary. The silence in the grocery store lasted only seconds, but to Dorothy it felt eternal. Officer Wilson's face hardened as he stared down Mr. Green. "Sir, we're conducting an investigation." "I need to ask you to step back," Wilson said, his hand moving to rest on his belt near his radio. "And I need to ask what evidence you have," Mr. Green replied, not budging an inch. "Because from where I'm standing, you're harassing a respected customer in my store." The younger officer, his nameplate read Officer Rivera, cleared his throat. "We received an anonymous call describing." Anonymous? A new voice joined in. A young man in his 20s had his phone out, recording the entire scene. "So somebody just called and said an old black lady was stealing, and you rushed right over." Dorothy recognized him as Anthony, one of her former students from years ago. He'd grown into a tall young man, but she remembered him as a shy fourth grader who loved science. More phones appeared in the growing crowd. Dorothy felt a strange mix of humiliation and hope as she realized what was happening. People were documenting this, people were standing up. "Everyone needs to back up now," Officer Wilson commanded, his voice rising. "This is police business." "It looks like harassment to me," called a woman from the back of the crowd. Officer Wilson turned to Dorothy, clearly frustrated by the situation spinning out of his control. "We're going to need to see the security footage. If you have nothing to hide, you won't mind waiting while we review it." Dorothy's legs were getting tired from standing so long, but she refused to show weakness. "I have nothing to hide, officer. But I do mind being treated like a criminal." Mr. Green stepped in again. "My office is in the back. We can review the footage there. Mrs. Williams, would you like to sit down? I can have someone bring you some water." Before Dorothy could answer, the crowd parted and a tall man in casual clothes walked forward. His hair was grayed at the temples, and he carried himself with authority. "Wilson, Rivera, what's going on here?" he asked. Officer Wilson straightened immediately. "Captain Taylor, sir. We're responding to a shoplifting call." Captain Taylor looked at Dorothy, then at the officers, then at the crowd with their phones recording. He shook his head slightly. "In all my 30 years on the force," he said, his voice carrying through the now silent store, "I've never seen a shoplifting suspect who hasn't left the store yet. Or one who's still in the middle of shopping with a half-filled cart." He gestured to Dorothy's cart with her list still visible on top. "And I certainly haven't seen one who needs to be confronted by two officers in front of an audience." Dorothy realized this man, Captain Taylor, was off-duty but clearly still held authority over these officers. A whisper of relief went through her, but the damage had already been done. Everyone had seen her empty her purse like a common thief. "I was just getting some groceries," Dorothy said, her voice finally betraying a slight wobble, "just like I do every Tuesday." Anthony, still recording, moved closer. "Mrs. Williams taught me in 4th grade. She's lived here forever. This is wrong, and everybody here knows it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "We were just following protocol," Officer Wilson insisted, though his confidence was clearly shaken. "Protocol?" Captain Taylor raised an eyebrow. "Show me where in the protocol that says to publicly search someone who hasn't left the store and has shown no evidence of concealing merchandise." Officer Rivera looked at his shoes. Wilson's jaw tightened. Dorothy felt a gentle hand on her arm. It was Mrs. Rodriguez from her church group. "Come sit down, Dorothy," she said softly. "Let's go to the cafe area." As Mrs. Rodriguez guided her toward the small cafe at the front of the store, Dorothy heard Captain Taylor continuing to speak with the officers in a low, stern voice. The crowd of onlookers followed, many still recording. Dorothy sank gratefully into a chair, finally letting her legs rest. The events of the last 20 minutes had drained her completely. She took a sip from the water someone had brought her and looked up to find herself surrounded by neighbors, former students, and even strangers, all watching with concern and something else she didn't expect to see, respect. What began as a humiliating ordeal was transforming into something powerful. Dorothy could feel it in the air, like the electricity before a storm. And the storm was just beginning to break. Dorothy sipped her water slowly, trying to calm her racing heart. The small cafe area of Green's Grocery had filled with people, some she knew well, others just familiar faces from around town, and a few complete strangers. All of them had witnessed her humiliation, and now all of them waited to see what would happen next. Anthony, her former student, sat down across from her, his phone still recording. "Mrs. Williams, are you okay? Do you need anything?" Before she could answer, a young woman with bright copper hair squeezed through the crowd. "The video's already got 300 shares," she announced, holding up her phone. "I put it on my social page with the store location. People are coming." Dorothy wasn't sure if that was good news or not. Part of her just wanted to go home and forget this awful day had ever happened. But another part, the part that had marched for civil rights in her youth, the part that had taught children to stand up for what's right, knew this moment mattered. "I never thought something like this would happen to me," Dorothy said, her voice steadier now. "Not in this town, not at my age." "It shouldn't happen to anyone," said a middle-aged man Dorothy didn't recognize. "My dad faced this kind of thing all the time back in the 60s. I can't believe we're still here in 2025. The crowd in the cafe grew larger as people continued to come in from the parking lot. Dorothy caught snippets of conversation, words like discrimination and lawsuit and community action. Her simple Tuesday shopping trip had somehow turned into something much bigger than herself. At the edge of the cafe, Captain Taylor was still speaking with Officers Wilson and Rivera. Their conversation had moved from heated to hushed, but Dorothy could see from Wilson's red face that he wasn't happy. Good, she thought. Let him feel a fraction of the discomfort I felt. Mr. Green approached Dorothy's table with a tall woman in a crisp business suit, the district manager, based on her name tag. "Mrs. Williams," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Patricia Howard, district manager for Greens. I want to personally apologize for what's happened in our store today. This is absolutely not how we treat valued customers." Dorothy shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. "Thank you, Ms. Howard, but I don't blame the store. Mr. Green and Ronnie tried to help." "We've reviewed the security footage," Mr. Green said. "There's absolutely nothing there that would justify what happened. We'd like to offer you—" He was interrupted by a commotion at the store entrance. The automatic doors slid open, and a woman in a police uniform with chief's insignia walked in, flanked by two other officers. The crowd parted as she made her way to the cafe area. Captain Taylor straightened and met her halfway. "Chief Walker," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was just about to call you." Chief Walker surveyed the scene, the crowd with their phones, the two officers looking increasingly uncomfortable, and Dorothy sitting at the cafe table like the eye of a hurricane. "I've already received 17 calls about this incident," Chief Walker said, including 3 from city council members. She turned to Officers Wilson and Rivera. "Wait for me outside. We'll discuss this at the station." The two officers made their way through the crowd, which parted silently to let them pass. No one spoke until the automatic doors closed behind them. Chief Walker approached Dorothy's table and, to everyone's surprise, pulled out a chair and sat down. "Mrs. Williams," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I believe we met at the community center fundraiser last month. You brought that amazing sweet potato pie." Dorothy nodded, surprised the chief remembered her. "I want to apologize on behalf of the department," Chief Walker continued. "What happened here today is not acceptable, not procedure, and not how we train our officers to interact with our community." The cafe had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching, recording, witnessing. "Thank you," Dorothy said simply, her dignity intact despite everything. "But I think this is bigger than just me now." She gestured to the crowd around them, young and old, different colors and backgrounds, all united in their outrage at what they'd seen. "You're right," Chief Walker agreed, looking around at the gathered faces. "This is about our community and what kind of community we want to be." Anthony stood up, still recording. "So what happens now? Those officers just walk away, back on duty tomorrow like nothing happened?" Chief Walker met his gaze steadily. "No, young man. That's not what happens now. What happens now is accountability." The word hung in the air like a promise. Dorothy felt something she hadn't expected to feel when this day began: hope. Not just for herself, but for her community, for her grandchildren, for the future. The storm was breaking, but what would emerge from it was still taking shape, still forming like clouds on the hoax. Storm was breaking, but what would emerge from it was still taking shape, still forming like clouds on the horizon. Resin. The next hour passed in a blur for Dorothy. People kept coming into the store, neighbors, church members, parents of former students, and strangers who had seen the videos online. The small cafe area couldn't hold everyone, so the crowd spilled out into the aisles. Mr. Green had stopped trying to run a normal business day and instead brought out bottles of water for everyone. Chief Walker remained seated across from Dorothy, taking notes as Dorothy recounted exactly what had happened. The chief's face remained professional, but Dorothy could see flashes of anger in her eyes at certain details. So he demanded you empty your purse before you'd even finished shopping or attempted to leave the store? Chief Walker asked, underlining something in her notepad. Yes, Dorothy said, right in front of everyone, like I was some kind of criminal. A tall man in his 60s pushed through the crowd. Dorothy recognized him immediately. Howard Thompson, a local attorney who had grown up in the same neighborhood as Dorothy. His daughter had been in Dorothy's class 20 years ago. Mrs. Williams, Howard said, reaching for her hand. My office has received 15 calls about what happened to you. I came as soon as I heard. Chief Walker stood and extended her hand. Howard, thank you for coming. Lisa, Howard nodded at the chief. I understand your officers have been removed from the scene. They're waiting outside, Chief Walker confirmed. This is completely against department protocol. Anonymous calls require verification before action, especially in cases like this. Howard turned back to Dorothy. Mrs. Williams, would you like me to represent you in this matter? Pro bono, of course. Dorothy hadn't even thought about lawyers or lawsuits. She just wanted to finish her shopping and go home. But looking around at all the faces watching her, waiting for her response, she realized this wasn't just about her anymore. I don't want money, she said firmly. I want change. Howard smiled. That's why I've always respected you, Mrs. Williams. Change it is. The store's doors slid open again, and a news crew walked in. A reporter Dorothy recognized from the local channel, and a cameraman following behind. The crowd shifted, making room. We don't have to talk to them if you don't want to, Chief Walker said quietly to Dorothy. Dorothy took a deep breath. Her mother had always told her that God puts you in places for a reason. Maybe this was her reason, her purpose for being in this store on this day. I'll talk to them, she decided. People need to see what happened here. The reporter approached cautiously, mindful of the protective circle that had formed around Dorothy. Mrs. Williams? I'm Diane from Channel 8 News. Would you be willing to share your experience with our viewers? Before Dorothy could answer, an unexpected voice rose from the back of the crowd. Wait, please wait. People turned to see a young woman pushing through the crowd. She wore a Green's grocery uniform and looked terrified. Dorothy didn't recognize her. I need to say something, the young woman said, her voice shaking. I'm the one who called the police. A murmur ran through the crowd. The young woman, her Namatic red Kelly, looked like she might faint from fear, but she continued. Mr. Wilson, Officer Wilson, he's my uncle. He told me to call if I ever saw, she swallowed hard, certain people shopping who looked suspicious. Tears filled her eyes. He said it would be good practice for me. I didn't know, I didn't think. The crowd went silent. Dorothy felt a strange mix of anger and pity for this young woman who looked barely out of high school. Chief Walker's face had turned to stone. Are you saying Officer Wilson instructed you to profile customers based on race? Kelly nodded miserably. He said it was part of loss prevention, but after I saw what happened, I knew it was wrong. I'm so sorry, ma'am. She looked directly at Dorothy, tears streaming down her face. So sorry. Mr. Green stepped forward, his face pale. Kelly, how long has this been going on? 3 months, she whispered, since I started working here. He said it would help my chances of getting into the police academy if I helped him catch shoplifters. Howard Thompson pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. Chief Walker was already on her radio, giving terse orders. Dorothy sat very still, processing this revelation. It wasn't just a random incident or a bad day. It was systematic, planned, deliberate. The reporter had stopped her cameraman from recording Kelly's face, but her microphone was capturing every word. This story had just become much bigger than one elderly woman's humiliation in a grocery store. It had become about something that had been hiding beneath the surface of their community for who knows how long. The next morning, Dorothy sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since yesterday. News of what happened at Green's Grocery was everywhere. Local TV, radio, and even some national news sites had picked up the story. She turned off her phone after midnight, needing some peace. A gentle knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Through the window, she could see her grandson Thomas standing on the porch, concern etched on his face. She'd called him last night to tell him what happened before he heard it from someone else. "Grandma," he said, wrapping her in a tight hug as soon as she opened the door. "I came as soon as I could get away from work. Are you really okay?" Dorothy patted his back. "I'm fine, child. Come in and sit down." Thomas followed her to the kitchen, his tall frame making her small house seem even smaller. At 32, he worked as an engineer in the city, an hour's drive away. He was the spitting image of her late husband, same serious eyes, same gentle manner. "I saw the videos online," Thomas said, accepting the fresh cup of tea she offered. "I couldn't believe it. Right here in town? At Green's?" Dorothy nodded. Sometimes these things hide in plain sight. It took something like this to bring it to light. Her doorbell rang again. This time it was Howard Thompson, the attorney, along with Chief Walker. "Mrs. Williams," Howard said as she invited them in. "I hope we're not intruding, but there have been some developments overnight that we thought you should hear directly from us." Dorothy introduced them to Thomas and led everyone to her small living room. The walls were covered with family photos and framed awards from her teaching days. Chief Walker looked like she hadn't slept. "Mrs. Williams, following yesterday's incident and Kelly's statement, we conducted an immediate investigation. We pulled Officer Wilson's record and found a disturbing pattern." She opened a folder and laid some papers on the coffee table. "Over the past year, Wilson has been involved in 15 similar incidents, all involving elderly shoppers of color, all based on anonymous tips, none resulting in actual shoplifting charges." Thomas leaned forward, studying the papers, and nobody noticed this pattern before. Chief Walker's face showed her shame. The incidents were spread across different stores in the area. No individual complaint seemed unusual enough to trigger a review. It was only when we looked at his entire record that the pattern became clear. "And Officer Rivera?" Dorothy asked, remembering the younger officer who had seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation. "He's been with the department for only 3 months, Chief Walker explained. "This was his first week partnered with Wilson. He's cooperating fully with our investigation and has provided a statement about Wilson's comments and behavior during their shifts together." Howard Thompson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Williams, the reason we're here is to let you know that the mayor has called an emergency town council meeting for this evening. They're going to address what happened publicly and announce some immediate changes to police department policy. They want you to be there," Chief Walker added. "Your voice matters in this conversation." Dorothy felt a wave of exhaustion at the thought of facing more people, more cameras. What good would my being there do? Thomas reached over and took her hand. "Grandma, you always told me that change happens when good people speak up. You've been speaking up your whole life, as a teacher, as a civil rights marcher, as a community member. This is another chance to make your voice heard." Dorothy looked at her grandson's earnest face. He was right, of course. She'd never been one to back down from what was right, even when it was difficult. "The mayor also wants to announce a new community oversight committee for the police department," Howard said. "They're asking if you would consider serving on it." Dorothy raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Me? At my age?" "Especially you," Chief Walker said firmly. "Because of your age, your experience, and your standing in this community. People trust you, Mrs. Williams. I trust you." Dorothy looked around her living room, at the photos of her family, her students over the decades, her community work. She'd spent her life building bridges and opening doors for the next generation. "When is this meeting?" she asked, decision made. 7 o'clock tonight at the community center, Howard replied. "We can arrange transportation for you." "Thomas will drive me," Dorothy said, squeezing her grandson's hand. He nodded in agreement. As they discussed the details, Dorothy felt something unexpected growing inside her, a sense of purpose stronger than the humiliation she'd felt yesterday. What had started as one of the worst days of her life was somehow turning into an opportunity to create lasting change. And Dorothy Williams had never been one to waste an opportunity. 6 months later, Dorothy stood at the podium in the community center, looking out at the packed room. The same room that had hosted that first emergency town council meeting now held a celebration, the official launch of the Williams Community Bridge Program. When I walked into Green's Grocery that Tuesday morning, Dorothy said, her voice strong despite her 79 years, I was just going to buy some peaches for Cobbler. I never expected to find myself at the center of something that would change our whole town. The audience laughed softly. Many of them had been there that day, either in person or through the videos that had spread across the country. What had started as one woman's humiliation had sparked a movement that none of them could have predicted. In the front row sat Mr. Green, who had turned his grocery store into a meeting place for the new community dialogue sessions. Next to him was Chief Walker, whose swift action had set the tone for real accountability. Officer Wilson had been fired within a week, and a review of his past cases had led to a broader department overhaul. The young Officer Rivera was now part of the new training program, sharing his experience as a cautionary tale for new recruits. The Williams Community Bridge Program isn't just about police reform, Dorothy continued. It's about bringing people together across all the divides that separate us: age, color, background, job title. It's about seeing each other as neighbors first. She gestured to the colorful banner behind her, designed by students at the local high school. It showed hands of different colors joined together to form a bridge. In the past 6 months, we've trained 15 community mediators, held 24 dialogue sessions, and created new protocols for how our police department interacts with the public. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. Dorothy looked down at her notes, then set them aside. She didn't need them. This story was written on her heart. The real change is happening in conversations at dinner tables, in classrooms, in church basements, and yes, in grocery store aisles. People are talking to each other, really talking, maybe for the first time. In the second row, Dorothy spotted Kelly, the young woman whose confession had blown the case wide open. After that day, Kelly had been terrified of losing her job, but Mr. Green had seen something in her, courage to admit a mistake and try to make it right. Now she was working part-time at Green's while attending community college, studying social work. Some people have asked me if I'm still angry about what happened, Dorothy said, her voice softening. The truth is, I was angry. I was hurt and humiliated. But holding onto that anger wouldn't change anything. Working for change, that's what heals the hurt. Thomas, her grandson, gave her a thumbs up from the side of the stage. Next to him stood Howard Thompson and several community leaders who had helped shape the Bridge program. I've lived in this town for most of my life, Dorothy continued. I've seen changes come and go. I've seen progress and setbacks. But I've never seen people come together quite like this before. Not just to protest something bad, but to build something good. The mayor stepped forward to present Dorothy with a plaque, a community service award that would now be given annually in her name. The audience rose to their feet, applauding. As Dorothy accepted the award, she spotted a familiar face at the back of the room. Captain Taylor, who had been the first to stand up for her that day in the grocery store, nodded respectfully. Beside him was Diane from Channel 8 News, whose fair coverage had helped keep the story in the public eye without sensationalizing it. I want to end with something my mother used to tell me, Dorothy said as the applause quieted. She'd say, Dorothy John, when life hands you trouble, look for the helpers. And if you can't find a helper, become one. She smiled at the faces before her, young and old, of every background, all part of her community. That day in the grocery store, I found plenty of helpers, and together, we've all become helpers for the next generation. That's how change happens, one person, one day, one grocery store at a time. As the audience rose again in a standing ovation, Dorothy felt a peace settle over her. The humiliation of that day would always be part of her story. But it wouldn't be the end of her story, not by a long shot. The real story was just beginning, written not just by her, but by an entire community that had found its voice.